Dan was a landscaper. He started small, but he had his eye on big things for his company. He'd grown his landscape business from startup to success in his market in a relative hurry. He was happy, his customers were happy, and he had a good core of people around him. This business has nowhere to go but up, thought Dan. And despite having to work hard to grow the business, Dan put his head down and worked even harder to take it to the next level. But this time, something was different. Dan worked just as hard, but growth was slower. And even though his sales were growing, his problems were growing faster. Dan felt like every time he turned his back, something else went wrong somewhere else. When he wasn't there to supervise, things didn't happen like they would when he was there, and customer complaints increased, and equipment broke down more often, and materials and tools were often forgotten. And despite his modest growth in sales, the news from his accountant was actually getting worse. Dan now was working twice as hard, but bringing home less money than before. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. It was obvious. As Dan's company grew, so did the number of people that worked for him. And the more people he employed, the less control Dan had over them, and the less time he had to train them. And before he knew it, Dan had guys working for him that he barely even knew, and they were driving his $40,000 trucks and operating his $60,000 equipment and managing the success and the failures of his jobs. For a few years, Dan blamed those failures on his people. If only I could find good people, he thought. Or if only my people cared more. Heck, if only if my employees had any common sense. Maybe Dan was right about his people, or maybe he was wrong. But blaming his people wasn't getting him anywhere. Despite all his hires, fires, and rehires, the same mistakes happened over and over again. There was no consistency to their work and to their planning. Jobs went over budget, and no one noticed until it was too late. Profits were unpredictable, and Dan managed from his bank account, just hoping that at the end of the year, things would just work out. But there was a good lesson for Dan in all of this. Your business is only as good as the employees who are in control. When Dan was smaller, he was in control of everything, and things ran smoothly. But as Dan grew bigger, he didn't have time to train his people on the way he did things. He had no time to build the systems up to help them. Dan's people were in control of his results, but nobody really knew what everyone else was doing or what everyone was supposed to be doing. Finally, Dan realized it wasn't just about his people. It was about his business. Because businesses have two kinds of problems: systems problems and people problems. When a problem occurs, it really boils down to one of two reasons. People didn't know what to do, who was supposed to do it, or when to do it. These problems are systems problems. The other type of problems is that people know exactly what to do, and they just didn't do it. These are people problems. As long as Dan blamed all his people all of the time, and their common sense or lack of it, he had the same problems over and over again. And he struggled to hold his people accountable to these problems, because there was nothing really to hold his people accountable to. Everyone was really quick to throw out easy excuses. I didn't know. I thought Dave was doing it, or nobody told me. Systems take the information from the owner's head and put it in the hands of the employees. Systems clearly answer the important questions to our businesses. What needs to be done? Who needs to do it? When it needs to be done? How the business insists it gets done? And why it's important it gets done that way. The best place to start for most contractors is job planning systems. Job planners take the information out of the estimator's head and put it in the hands of the people who are actually going to do the work. They answer the questions like, how many hours were estimated for these tasks? What equipment and material is needed? And what is the proper order of operations? When the foremen know exactly what the estimator was planning, only then can they help make it become a reality. People work to goals. If you give your people hours, Their job, especially the foreman's job, is to make sure it comes in on time and on budget. If you don't give them hours, foremen can't possibly manage their crew's time effectively. And it's also most likely that your foremen are going to assume you really don't care if it comes in on time or not. For if you really cared, you'd be giving them the information. Job planners give your crews the information they need to manage their own work, so you don't have to. You should be spending your time managing the business, not the field work. That's the foreman's job. Are you frustrated by constant equipment breakdowns and poor care of expensive trucks, tools, and equipment? If you haven't spent the time on equipment systems, your employees won't spend the time to care for them properly. Equipment systems ensure that people know what equipment to expect, when to inspect it, and how to carry out an inspection. If everyone in your crews was left up to their own way to inspect, some are going to inspect it properly, others are just going to do a quick inspection, and still others aren't going to bother to inspect it at all. The result of no equipment systems is poor care, increased breakdowns, and this is going to kill your field productivity. Quality inspection systems ensure that clear standards exist for work that's called done. A good way to enforce this is checklists. Checklists can help people run through the same list of checks and balances to make sure that before they deem the work done, it meets all our standards. That way, every foreman is inspecting their work just like the owner would. And with good inspections, we'll minimize revisits to site to finish punch list items that should have been done right in the first place. Paperwork systems ensure that everyone is communicating properly in the business. The office needs paperwork to understand what's happening in the field. The field hates paperwork because it slows them down from doing what they do best, field work. That said, paperwork is necessary for good communication within the business. Paperwork systems make sure that everyone understands what paperwork needs to be completed, how it needs to be completed, and when it needs to be handed in. The result of good paperwork is better communication, less wasted time looking for information, and a more accountable and more informed company culture. As Dan worked his way through these systems, things for Danscaping began to get easier. Change wasn't easy, but it was easier than fixing problems all the time. And Dan started to enjoy managing his business more. With systems in place, he could hold his people more accountable. They, in turn, had the information to become more responsible. And they got the work done the way Dan expected, because now his systems clearly communicated his expectations to his people. The more systems Dan built, the smoother things ran. His crews felt better because the expectations were clear and consistent. Dan felt better because the communication was clear and people were acting like he would act. And his business performed better because the business operated more the way it did when Dan was in control of his field operations. Except for now, Dan had foremen who could control it for him. Dan's business began to grow again, but this time so did his profits. Dan and his staff had less problems to deal with. People were trained because the systems were clear, and productivity improved, and so did Dan's sales. The more productive his staff were, the less it cost Dan to do his work, and the less it cost Dan to do the work, the less he needed to charge his customers. More productive, more profits, more sales. Works for everybody. As Dan's business outgrew his control, Dan realized that indeed his business was only as good as his employees, and his employees were only as good as the information and systems that Dan's business created for them. With great systems came great employees, and with great employees, Dan grew a great business. Thanks for watching. We're the Landscape Management Network, and our goal is to help great landscape contractors build great landscape businesses. Our systems library contains over 700 forms, documents, systems, procedures, and checklists to improve the consistency of your work and the quality of your company. And each and every one was built for and in actual landscape companies. It's everything you wished you had, but never knew existed. Memberships with access to every single one of our systems start at just $99 a month. There's never been a more affordable an easier way to improve your landscape business. For more information, check us out at www.landscapemanagementnetwork.com.